Hello, everyone. Good to see you all. How is everyone this afternoon? Okay, thank you, Matt. Good. Okay, any questions? Okay, I had planned today to talk a bit more about the vices of, actually to talk about the vices of the political system. One of the most interesting documents you're going to read in the course of your lifetimes. And I realized about half an hour ago I hadn't sent it to you and hadn't posted it on Blackboard. So I apologize for keeping you in the dark about this for so long. So James Madison wrote this we think in the spring of 1787. And what it is, has anyone had a chance to read it in the short time that I've sent it to you? I mean, some of you might have read it already. Yes, Paul has. Any preliminary thoughts, Paul? I apologize. You raise your hand, you volunteer, and then I start asking you more questions.
Yeah, so I briefly skimmed it,
Okay.
but I think he raises a bunch of good points about how the states aren't going to agree with each other, and how their competing interests will lead to a weaker overall federal government.
Right, right. In fact, they had led to a weaker overall federal government, which is the problem. I mean, what to me, anyone else, by the way, I don't want to have Paul and me being the only ones who are empowered to speak, since I know everyone here has opinions and many of them are good. Okay, so he's thinking about all of the problems in this political society. And to me, what's really astonishing is the way he breaks them down. And it could be he's already thinking this way and he's just kind of using this as an excuse. I mean, when we could simply go through what the problems were in 1786, 1787, and then get to the vices and just see how Madison analyzes them. But it might just be useful for us to take a closer look at this. So what I am going to do now is break us into smaller groups, and we'll have each group take a look at one or two of these pieces. Okay. So why don't we do this? Start reading it, everyone. You don't need to read the first 4.5 or so pages, which are the introduction. Get to the part where it's April 1787 and you actually have the document itself. And then you'll be assigned to a group which will focus on one or two of these. You as a group will read it, then we'll all reconvene and talk about what we have found out and how our friend Madison analyzes what's happening in 1786, 1787. Okay, so I think 1, 2, 3. Okay, we have 8 groups. You'll be in one of 8, and I will get back in touch with you once you have successfully found your group in a breakout room. Okay, so you're about to be dispersed and have fun. Okay, James, you should join breakout room number 2 with Chloe and Matt to talk about vices of the political system number 3. Okay? Hello, Tessa.
Hi, Professor.
Okay, how are you doing?
Good. I have bad connection, so I was just in and out for the
Okay,
first beginning of class.
right. Okay, so what we have done is divide up into groups, and everyone is reading part of the vices of the political system. And they'll be done with that in about 10 minutes. I can send you into a group that's reading something relatively short if you'd like, or you can just wait here.
Okay, I can wait here. I started to read some of it when you sent it out as well.
Okay. So why don't you keep reading then? And
Okay.
you just reading the first 4.5, not the first 4.5 pages, but the actual items that Madison is listing, okay?
Okay, great. Thank you.
Okay. So that was certainly fun and interesting, something you probably wouldn't have done on your own. Okay, so any overall questions or thoughts on this process? Since now that you've all each read a piece of this big important document. Okay. Then why don't we start with numbers 1 and 2? And let's see, Lindsay, Jeffrey, Melissa, and Kelsey. Oh, you were leading off with 1 and 2.
Yeah, I can start it
Great.
off. So for numbers 1 and 2, let me just pull up the document again. So 1 is failure of the states to comply with the constitutional requisitions. And after reading the blurb, we kind of decided that when it comes down to it, if the states are not all in unison and like in agreement with everything that the Constitution says, then that puts the whole nation at risk of just not being on one page. And that is kind of how like the Civil War started. The Civil War started. And then we also talked about the Confederacy and how that was one example that was already mentioned, but we went into detail and talked about how that radicalization and that mindset really not deviated off, but like it didn't fall in line with what was presented in the Constitution. So that was one example.
Okay, I'm not quite sure I understand what you mean by the Confederacy and what Madison means by the Confederacy.
I'm sorry?
You said, you started talking about the Civil War, which is 80 years after this. And so I'm wondering what you mean by the Confederacy deviating from the Constitution, because at this point there isn't a Constitution.
No, we were talking about, because they presented the Confederacy as an example in that little blurb, and we were just talking about like in terms of failure to comply, that was one of the things we were talking about when it comes down to disagreement with each other and like with the states.
And what's the Confederacy he's talking about?
I'm not sure. Let me read this.
Because I think at this time in the 1780s, when someone's talking about the Confederacy, they essentially just mean the 13 states that are operating as a confederation or a confederacy. By the way, I'm not meaning to pick on you, Lindsay, because
that's fine.
Okay, then I will pick on you. No, a number of other, we read a word that we know has a certain meaning today, and then it's kind of a trick then to try to understand what it would have meant at this time. And so don't get misled by what we know. But anyway, okay, good. The first one's relatively short. And so why don't we move on to the second one? And you can turn this over to one of your compatriots if you'd like. You're doing a great job, though.
Yeah, I can turn it over to one of my group mates.
Do you mind just scrolling up just a bit so I could read the second one?
Sure.
Professor, thank you. So the encroachments by the states on the federal authority. To my understanding, let me actually just pull up my own tab so I can scroll freely. To my understanding, what we talked about specifically was the treaties of Georgia and how when the I shouldn't call them colonists, should I? I should call them rather the people of Georgia.
They're states now, yeah.
Yeah, so the people of Georgia, they needed, or rather they wanted land. They took that from the natives. Then they wanted more land. They took the rest of the land from the natives. From my understanding, that's kind of what went on here for the second part of the document.
Yeah.
I'm still trying to understand the federal authority aspect of it. I didn't know if it was more so that the states were kind of not in agreement with the federal authority, therefore that put the nation at risk, or more so it was like the states needed more land, so they kind of depended on the federal authority for that land.
Lindsay, you have your hand up?
Yeah, I also wanted to ask as well. When I read this over, I was thinking about the Enoki Wars, or the Enoki War. I'm not sure if that has anything to do with this, but I know that they depended a lot on federal authority to take or get more land, which eventually led
Which war? I didn't hear all of what you were saying.
the Enoki, Onocee, or no Chi. I'm not sure how to
Okay.
pronounce it.
Yeah.
It
Okay.
was against the Creek Indians. I don't know if
Mhm.
that applies to this, but that was just a question I had.
Okay. I think, we may be trying to become, Madison certainly has examples in mind. And I don't know why this thing just popped up on my screen. My apologies. So Georgia is making treaties with the Creek Indians, for crying out loud. I'm just going to stop sharing my screen. And Georgia's making treaties with the Creek Indians according to the Confederation, the Articles of Confederation. That is a responsibility of Congress to make treaties with the Indians. States aren't supposed to do that. So when Georgia is doing that, that's a state encroaching on federal power. It's interesting. This is the second thing he lists as a problem in the political system. If you're a member of the state, you're going to say, oh, no, we should be doing this because no one else is. And Madison's pointing this out as actually a problem. And then the next ones he mentions are Virginia and Maryland are making agreements about trade in the Chesapeake Bay. And Pennsylvania and New Jersey are making agreements about trade on the Delaware River. And the states, remember, Madison might have been in favor of Virginia and Maryland doing this because they needed to do something. On the other hand, he sees this as an encroachment on what the federal government should be doing. And so that is really the problem. Or Massachusetts keeping up troops. Do we know why Massachusetts is keeping up troops? Well, because of this rebellion in Massachusetts, in Berkshire County, Hampshire County, and so on. So states are acting because the federal government can't. But Madison is pointing this out as a problem in the political system. There's a reason the federal government cannot act, and the states shouldn't be then encroaching. He's not saying, the states didn't have much of a choice. They had to do something. He's pointing this out as a vice of the entire political system. Yes, that's good. Okay, anything more that you want to say, Lindsay or Melissa or Jeffrey or Kelsey, about numbers 1 and 2? Anyone else have any questions for them?
I was just going to
Yes,
add
Jeffrey.
that number 2 focused more on like the separation of state versus federal power, which you basically talked about, and how the Treaty of Georgia is basically how the state of Georgia tried to basically force out the Cherokee from their land by not consulting with like the federal government, and that basically led to like the Supreme Court case where the federal government.
Right, you're getting ahead of yourself now. We're still in 1787 and you're up in 1832. And so we need to rein it back and look at what's happening in 1787. But you're absolutely right. This is about state versus federal power. And Madison is, as a couple of you pointed out, a proponent of federal power, and he sees the states as encroaching on it. But yeah, you're absolutely right. He sees these as, yeah, well, I appreciate the fact that everyone wants to move faster and get to the 1830s, much more exciting. I'd rather talk about Andrew Jackson too. Much more colorful character than James Madison, I've got to say. I don't know. We'll leave that to a future discussion. Who we would rather, I don't know, have a drink with, or invite to the next class, or whatever it is you young people like to do with interesting folks, aside from present company accepted. Okay. Any further thoughts? And by the way, I'm sorry. You guys are raising good questions, and I jump in and start bullying poor Lindsay about her choice of words and so on. So, okay, good. How about number 3? Let's see, Chloe and Matt, you were looking at number 3?
Yeah, so basically we are looking at number 3, which is violations of the law of nations and of treaties. And basically we're surmising Madison is complaining about the individual states breaking the treaties originally signed with France and with Holland. And much like the other point, talked about making treaties with neither Native American tribes or not, it's getting to the point where these treaties are overlapping and there is no real like central authority that's regulating all of these.
Yeah. Whoops. You're muted, Matt.
Oh, sorry. And the other issue is because of these violations, especially with France and Holland, those countries haven't responded in a way that was like negative towards the United States, but this wasn't a guarantee that this would continue. So
Right.
basically, he's arguing that if these continue to happen, there will be repercussions that affect all of the states as opposed to just an individual state.
Right. Good. Perfect. Yeah. Anything to add, Ahmed?
You summarized it perfectly.
I'm sorry, Chloe. Good. Good. Yeah, he did. Okay, good. So why don't we move on to number 4 then? And that's Jovan and Ahmed, trespasses of the states on the rights of each other.
I can start.
Great.
Number 4 basically deals with states really dealing with interstate taxes. So basically, it's all about money. The biggest thing it talks about is, for example, Virginia will do taxes against Maryland corporations and citizens of Maryland, and tariffs against them. So that way it's more preferential towards Virginia. And basically the problem is every state is doing that. And so it's not really promoting like a national harmony like Madison wants.
Yeah.
He thinks the states should act as a union, but they're not really doing that. They're kind of jostling against each other. They're jostling separately with foreign powers. And they also having different currencies. And it can lead to people in one state being defrauded by citizens of another. And it's kind of just horribly mismanaged and unbalanced. And Madison just wants it all to be federalized.
Yeah, good. Yeah. I mean, he sees all these problems, and then he is seeing a solution with having the federal government take charge, having a federal government. Okay, so we're getting at what the problems are, and now we're actually starting to get at what the solutions might be or might not be. So why don't we turn to numbers 5 and 6, which Julia, Ashley, and Mitch were looking at. Want of concert in matters where common interest requires it, and want of guarantee against internal violence.
Yeah, so for number 5, want of concert in matters where common interest requires it. When we're looking at this, we figured out what he was meaning by this is kind of like same, like the need to create federal or national laws where they are needed. So some of the examples he gives for this is laws concerning naturalization. So like laws concerning immigration or people wanting to become citizens of the United States. Like it would obviously pose some problems if someone immigrated to New Jersey and they want to become a citizen, but then if someone immigrated to New York or Massachusetts and want to be a citizen, but those states all had different laws on how to become a citizen, that would pose some problems. And then he goes on to literary property. So he's saying, there needs to be some type of the same law across the whole country when it comes to making patents, because again, if someone patented the same thing in 2 different states, then they tried selling or promoting their product across state lines, they again could run into some issues there.
Right.
And then he also talks about things like infrastructure. So saying like how there needs to be, canals and other things that just promote the general infrastructure. So there can be things like trade between the states and whatnot that moves freely and good.
Good. Yeah, at this time, Noah Webster had written a book, actually a spelling book, and in order to get a copyright on it in the country as a whole, he needed to go to each state and have each state legislature pass a law giving him a copyright on it. Otherwise, he would have printed it in Boston or in New Haven, and someone in Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore would have been printing copies, and he, as an author, wouldn't get anything from it. So yeah, so this is, of course, a big issue if you're writing books. Not a big issue if you're a publisher, unless, of course, you wanted to have sole rights to something. But yeah, that's an important issue. And then I think underlying this, without that, and whether you mentioned patents, canals, and other things, you're not going to have any kind of economic development possible. Okay, what about number 6? The guarantee of the states against internal violence.
So basically with this one, they're talking about the differences between the majority and the minority. And he
Mhm.
talks about the Republican theory and that how throughout his actual experience, you can notice that a minority can take over a majority, but Republican theory is basically saying that the majority has power overall and a minority really can overtake that. But in this, he's basically saying if they have the right resources like military life, that they'll be able to take over the majority. And then one interesting thing that we were talking about is the last sentence at the end where they say where slavery exists, the Republican theory becomes more fallacious, and that means like to become ridiculous and not true. So basically saying that Republican theory that a majority can't be overtaken by a minority is basically ridiculous to think about in places where slavery exists, because as you were saying to us in our breakout group, that in some states that slaves took up about 40% of a population in a state. So I mean, they still might be considered a minority, but that's a lot of people.
That is a lot of people. And so what does that mean? It's an interesting way he's putting this, talking about majorities and minorities. And so who is he talking about as being the people?
I'm kind of interpreting it as maybe the people who agree with the laws and the ruler, that they're the majority, and that I don't necessarily know if they're talking about from a statistical standpoint in numbers, the majority and minority. Is it more of like they talk about those who are impoverished and those who don't have the right to suffrage, so they would be considered a minority because they don't have the same rights as the majority?
Interesting. Anyone else have any thoughts on this? It's an interesting point he's raising, and about the Republican theory in general, which is that the majority governs. And so you have the majority governs, and we all kind of subscribe to this. This is the Republican theory. But then, as you mentioned, there are people who aren't voters, but they're still part of the people. I mean, he mentions this 1/3 of those who may participate in the choice of rulers, that is this is a minority of the voters, may be rendered a majority by the accession of those whose poverty excludes them from a right of suffrage. So you have a system where we believe the majority should govern, but not everyone is able to vote. But here you may have a minority who might be able to, what does he mean by the accession of those whose poverty excludes them? Who are these folks?
So I saw that as like the non-landowners,
Yeah.
the slaves, the women, they might not make up the majority of those who are able to vote, but they still might be the majority population.
Yeah. And so they might, and again, in the previous sentence, he's been talking about 1/3 conquering the remaining 2/3. And now he's also talking about 1/3 of the voters conquering 2/3 by bringing in those who are excluded. And then that last line that really is an interesting one that Julia was talking about, where slavery exists, the Republican theory becomes still more fallacious. That is, he's understanding that we might be talking about creating a government just for this small group who are property holders or taxpayers or adult white men, but recognizing that the political community actually is composed of a lot more people. And it makes it much more difficult to create a system. So this is a fascinating one, talking about the want of guarantee against internal violence. I mean, really talking about the tendency in a state to have, political violence, attacks against the Constitution or the laws and what protects it. And where slavery exists, the Republican theory becomes still more difficult, because here you have a large population that is subdued under the law, but might emerge. Anything more? By the way, I'm sorry for monopolizing the discussion on this one. And Mitch and Julia and Ashley were doing a very good job with it until I jumped in. So anything further we should say about this one as a big problem? In the Republican theory, or are we done with it?
That's pretty much all we had to say about it.
Okay, thanks, Mitch. Then why don't we move on to number 7, which Anthony, Tricia, and Brittany were looking at? The want of sanction to the laws and of coercion in the government of the Confederacy.
Yeah, so here Madison is pretty much just criticizing, or the fact that he doesn't believe that the Confederacy, or rather that a federal government will have the power to actually enact laws in the states. Coercion being the power to do that. So he goes really in depth about it, because he's talking about like minorities and the partiality of the different members of Congress being pretty much not being able to serve the states properly, looking out only for themselves.
We really are getting into a much more difficult problem here. Remember, one of the big problems the Confederation had was not being able to raise a source of revenue, and would have been relatively easy if we just said, well, we'll let Congress print up money, or we will let Congress collect a 5% tax on imports. But he's pointing out that there's a much more fundamental problem here. And he's really now getting at the fundamental problem, and it is that Congress doesn't have any real power. And it would be relatively simple to give the Congress additional power. But what he's really beginning to get at here is that Congress in itself isn't created in the right way. That is, the Confederation as it exists, the Confederacy as it exists, doesn't have the power it should, because it shouldn't have the power it should. And he talks about why it was created and so on. I'm sorry, now I'm pontificating on this, and Anthony was doing a good enough job pontificating if he chose to. Anything more to add on this one?
No, Anthony pretty much said it all.
Okay. Thanks, Tricia. And then we get to another reason why it doesn't have any power. And let's see, Julia, Schuyler, and V were looking at number 8, the want of ratification by the people in the Articles of Confederation.
So for ours, we kind of said how people seem to view the Articles of Confederation in different ways, and that people will tend to agree more with their state constitution and their state rules as opposed to the Articles of Confederation as they are right now. And that the second part of it was that if one state in the Union were to break a rule, that other states would kind of believe that they could follow as well. And same would go for dissolving the Union. So if one state were to leave the Union, that other states would also feel as though they could also leave the Union.
Yeah. Okay. So these, I guess, are problems then, if states can do this. end. Okay, let's see. Anything more to add on this one? It seems fairly straightforward, at least the way you've explained it. So why don't we then move on to numbers 9 and 10 with Kelsey and Paul we're looking at. The multiplicity of the laws and the
Yeah, so for number 9, we have the multiplicity of the laws of several states. So that basically, in short, the easiest way to surmise it is basically saying Madison believes that state laws are too numerous and they've become over bloated with just like language and stuff. And he believes that all the laws and ideas of the laws within the several states can be condensed into like a tenth of what they are now.
Yeah.
So there's a line there. Right there. A review of several codes will show every necessary and useful part of the least voluminous of them might be compressed into 1/10 of the compass. So
Yeah.
basically saying there's a bunch of useless laws and their ideas can be encapsulated
Yeah.
in a short thing. So the laws are too long.
Yeah, too many laws, too much verbiage and so on. Yeah. And he also has this thing calling them a nuisance, the luxuriancy of legislation. That is, you have all this. And then the next one is the mutability of the laws. Is that another word that we have trouble with, mutability? Paul or Kelsey?
I guess basically that states can repeal and create laws very quickly. And because each state is doing that, it can lead to kind of, like it said, like instability becomes a snare, not only to our citizens, but to our foreigners also. So it's affecting states, it's affecting other states and like foreign affairs.
Yeah, yeah. It's a vicious legislation. Yeah, it's, law is constantly changing. You know, Pennsylvania one year decides it will charter a national bank. The next year it revokes the charter, legislature changes its mind, and you can never keep up with what the law is. So this is a bad thing. Okay, very good. And then we get to the final one. Well, actually, he had meant to do 12. He only does 11. And the final is the injustice of the laws of the states. And this is the longest and most complicated and most interesting of them. So let's see, Trevor and James and Haley and Leah had taken a look at number 11.
So he split it into 2 parts. In the first one, he talks about how there's 3 reasons for people to get into politics. One is ambition, the second is for personal interest, and the third is for the good of the people, or the good of the public. And he says that it's hard to discern which of these things people get into politics for, and that's what makes the political
Actually, let's see. Does he say it's hard to tell? And he says here, the first 2 are proved by experience to be the most prevalent. That is, people run for office from ambition or personal interest, as opposed to the public good. And I'm really wondering what your experience has been with that. Is he right or is he wrong? Is this changed since 1787?
I would say not really. That still seems pretty common.
Okay. So people are running for office because they're ambitious or they think they're going to get something out of it. By the way, no one wants to speak up and say that. Paul, yes.
I would say that current officials claim that they're doing it for the good of the public good, but they are very motivated by the first 2, but they won't come out and say that they are.
Well, you know, I've had more experience with watching political processes than you have, and I've never seen anyone saying, I am doing this for ambition or personal interest. Usually anyone is going to say public good. I mean, would you vote for someone who said, I'm running because I need a job and I want to see I want to have power? It might be honest, but it's not going to win you vote. So it's the public good. And of course, you'd be an idiot not to say you're doing this for the public good. So, but here Madison, who also had more experience running for office than any of us had, says the first two are proved by experience to be the most prevalent. That is, he saw this. And even though I suspect there are very few candidates in his day saying I'm running because I'm ambitious and I think I can gain from, but I'm sorry to poison your minds against the political process here. Okay. So the candidates who feel the first two are most industrious and most successful in pursuing their object. That is, if you're the kind of political figure who's interested in the public good, you're probably going to be less industrious and successful in pursuing your object than those who are in it for ambition or personal interest. And they often form, I'm sorry, now, Trevor, you were doing a great job and now I've jumped in. So go on.
So I think this next part is kind of what I was talking about. Like how easily are base and selfish measures masked by pretext of public good and apparent expediency.
Yeah.
So that's like where it becomes difficult to tell what people's motives are.
Right. But here's someone who's an insider who kind of knows what people's motives are. And I don't know, do you suppose, is he saying 1/3 of his motives are public good, or is he 1/3 of the members of the elected body who is interested in the public? I'm not discounting the public good as something that even the most cynical of these characters might have some interest in. Yeah. It's a pretext, and he talks about the same arts and industry which succeeded in the first instance. Okay, good. We probably spent too long beating up on politicians here, politicians of 1787, not of course politicians today, because we've cured this particular problem. So go on.
So this next part, I think James is going to talk about.
So in the second part, he talks about how the majority in most cases will always like oppress the minority, whether that be in cases of religion or like debtor lender sort of relationships. So he says that that's kind of something inherent in a republic, and that like everyone kind of will always advocate for their personal interest over someone else's, even if that means that the other person will be harmed. So he kind of sums it up at the end. He says, in small republics, the sovereign will is sufficiently controlled from such a sacrifice of the entire society. And he kind of says that the republic sort of can't be neutral in this, like they're unable to be neutral, and that they'll kind of always inevitably side with like the oppressor.
Yeah, good. This is, by the way, that was a wonderful summation of this relatively complicated thing. Because look, he talks about how any political society is divided into different interests and factions. And you mentioned some of them: creditors, debtors, rich, poor, husbandmen. Do we know what a husbandman is or was? I don't think it's a word we use much today. Husbandman is a farmer. So farmers, merchants, manufacturers, that is, these are different interests. Members of different religions, followers of different political leaders, people who live in different places, owners of different kind of property. And so this is one of the issues here. In a Republican government, the majority, as we've already said, gives the law. And then he talks about when an interest or common passion unites a majority, what is to restrain them from violating the rights or interests of the minority or individuals? And then this harkens back to what Trevor was saying. Only 3 motives will prevent a majority from oppressing a minority. A regard to their own good is involved in the general permanent good of the community, and that's certainly nice. Second, respect for character. And then third, let's see, where does he get to the third? Yeah, it's a long one here. on respect for character, and he talks about all the places where this hasn't worked. And then third, will religion, the only remaining motive, be a sufficient restraint? And he says, no, it actually can be worse. If a religion is kindled into an enthusiasm, it's increased by the sympathy of a multitude. And so he sees religion in its coolest state, it is not infallible and may become a motive to oppression. Okay, and then you have this section here, place 3 individuals in a situation where the interest of each depends on the voice of the others. Give 2 of them an interest opposed to the rights of the third. Will the latter be secure? Will it? That's, I mean, it is a rhetorical question, but I think he imagines you might answer it. Let's suppose that Kelsey, Julia, and Matt all were combined together, and it would be in the interests of Julia and Matt to take away Kelsey's property. Would your property be safe, Kelsey? No. You don't trust these 2?
Well, it's 2 against 1.
It is 2 against 1, yeah.
Yeah, the majority decides, then, you know.
Okay. So you're not trusting of these 2 worthy individuals who are motivated by the public good? And okay, so that's and then he says, no, the prudence of every man would shun the danger. And then will 2,000 in a like situation be less likely to encroach on the rights of 1,000? And he talks about the notorious factions and oppressions which take place in all these places. So actually, this is something that is kind of important. We've all been jumping ahead in political theory, and now Madison is actually jumping back to the standard political theory argument of the day, was that republics have to be small where everyone has a common interest. And here Madison is saying, actually, a small republic is going to be worse, because you're not going to have a common interest. He's just gone through all the interests people have. And then B, you have the fact that you have a smaller group and there's nothing to restrain them. So I think we're out of time. We'll have a quiz next time, probably about the Virginia and religion. And then we will talk more about this particular political theory and why it is important. So thank you. By the way, everyone did a great job presenting what was in this document. So thank you for reading it carefully. Now you have a chance to read the rest of it, and we can continue talking about it on Wednesday.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you, Professor.
Good to see you all. Take care.